Hello, thank you for joining with me. I am reading from A Course in Miracles, complete and annotated edition. I am reading with the group Course Companions, the ACIM study group. You can find them on Facebook, and Emily Bennington is leading this with Robert Perry, who is the editor of the complete and annotated edition of A Course in Miracles. We are on day 50, Cameo 14. Today I do not have the study guide for this week, but when it is posted, I will go ahead and read the study guide notes for Cameo 14. The Chain of Miscreation. This is in Appendix 1 under the Cameo essays. At the beginning of what is now Chapter 3 of the text, Jesus gave Helen and Bill an assignment to review the earlier part of the Course. The notes Helen had scribed up to this point as preparation for the next part. However, it seems that on the appointed day the planned study period did not happen. Instead, little bits of resentment and conflict added up over the course of one day and led to wasted time and to the day ending with the two of them upset with each other. So Jesus decided to give them a lengthy discourse on how this happened, how their errors had ultimately interfered with their review period. As Helen then dictated this material into the urtext, it was filled out with more material. Our transcript below will be a combination of both the notes and the urtext, including this one paragraph introduction. The following is the only detailed description which need be written down as to how error interferes with preparation. Jesus had characterized their review as preparation. The events specifically referred to here could be any events, nor does their particular influence matter. It is the process which is to be noted here and not its results. The kind of beliefs and the fallacious premises involved on misthought are as well exemplified here as elsewhere. There is nothing of special interest about the events described below except their typical nature. If this is a true course in mind training, then the whole value of this section rests only in showing you what not to do. The more constructive emphasis is, of course, on the positive approach, what to do. Mind watching would have prevented any of this from occurring and will do so anytime you permit it to. So mind watching would have prevented any of this from occurring and will do so anytime you permit it to. Footnote 1. All quotations without page numbers in this cameo are from Helen's notes, with your text additions. Throughout these cameo essays, we have corrected spelling errors in the notes for ease in reading. This introduction carefully frames the following discourse. It's not a scolding about these particular events and their negative results. Rather, it is only about what can be learned from the entirely typical process they represent. Yet even then, the discourse's focus on what not to do is less constructive than a more positive emphasis on mind watching. And so, Jesus says, this is the only time he is going to give such a discourse. Now the discourse begins. Tell Bill that the reason why he was so strained today is because he allowed himself a number of fear-producing attitudes. They were fleeting enough to be more will-o-wisps than serious will errors, but unless he watches this kind of thing, he will find the notes fearful, and knowing him well will misdistantiate. His unprovoked irritation was unpardonable except by himself, and he did not choose to pardon it. You did, but I'm afraid you were under some strain in doing so. This was unfortunate and weakened your own ability to behave healingly toward Bill at the time. Later also toward Lewis, both of whom did act stupidly. But one stupidity at a time is usually enough. You are getting too close to the misuse of mental retardation when stupidity sets in all around. Here we will see the beginning of what Jesus will call later the chain of miscreation, in which an initial error leads to a whole chain of further errors. The fear-producing attitudes Bill entertains cause him strain. If unchecked, this kind of thing will lead him to fear the course and therefore wrongly distance himself from it, which is misdistantiate. Apparently, his strain also contributed on this day to unprovoked irritation. Bill could have pardoned himself for this unpardonable offense, but he didn't. Helen did, but only under strain, which then made her too weak to respond kindly to Bill's stupidity, and Lewis's too, both of which she thereby compounded with her own. In using the word stupidity, Jesus may simply be referencing Helen's thoughts, just as he is almost certainly doing with the word unpardonable. That Jesus doesn't really mean unpardonable is shown by the fact that Bill was supposed to have pardoned his error, and Helen rightly did. Bill, having already weakened himself, was very unmiracle-minded, first by not asking Dora if she wanted a lift in the cab which was going her way. Even if she didn't want it, she would have been able to use the thought well. There is probably no human error that is more fear-provoking in the will-behavior conflict sense than countering any form of error with error. The result can be highly inflammable. By reacting to Dora's stupidity with his own, all of the elements which are virtually certain to engender fear have been provided. Bill should note that this is one of the few times that he had to wait for a cab. He thought he took care of it by holding the door of a cab which did come for that lady, but he was misguided in his belief. Beliefs are thoughts and thus come under Christ's guidance, not control. Actually, by giving this cab to her, he was very unkind to you. It was quite apparent that you were extremely cold and also very late. The idea that giving the cab would atone for his previous errors was singularly out of place and well calculated to lead to further error. If instead of attempting to atone on his own, he had asked for guidance, there would have been no difficulty whatever in the cab situation. It was not necessary that anyone wait at all. His original slight to Dora, because of his own need to get home as he perceived it, stopped him from benefiting from this time-saving device of the miracle. He would have gotten home much quicker if he had taken time to use time properly. To reconstruct the above, Dora did something that is called here an act of stupidity. Bill then responded to her error with an error of his own. He didn't offer to let Dora share the cab that he and Helen were waiting for because of his perceived need to get home quicker. But countering her error with his own led to the exact opposite result. He had to wait for a cab an unusually long time. Had he offered her a lift, he would have given her a miracle, an act of kindness. This would then have invoked the time-saving property of miracles, which would have summoned a cab more quickly. Sensing his mistake, he tried to atone on his own by graciously giving away to another woman the cab that did come. But this was simultaneously a well-calculated unkindness to Helen, who was clearly extremely cold and also very late. Now, without a miracle to save them time, they had to wait. Here, then, we have a continuation of the chain of errors, which incorporates Dora's era and stretches onward to impact Helen. You were still suffering from strain, see above, and got quite irritated at the girl who stood next to the door on the side which blocked its opening. Her presence there made it necessary each time the door was opened to hold it for a much longer time than was necessary, and you were angry because this made you cold. Actually, the girl was taking care of the younger child who was standing outside, and both of them were really mentally retarded. If you will remember, the older girl asked you very uncertainly about the bus, and you were well aware at the time of her extreme uncertainty. It would have been much wiser had you built up her confidence instead of associating with her stupidity. Helen's lingering strain from forgiving Bill then spilled over into irritation at a girl whose position near the door required it to be repeatedly held open a long time, making Helen cold. However, Helen had noticed how extremely uncertain the girl was, and being a specialist in mental retardation in children, she should have put two and two together and realized the girl was really mentally retarded. Then she could have given her a miracle by building up her confidence. Instead, through Helen's surprisingly dense irritation, she joined the girl in retardation. This reduced your own efficiency, and the only thing that saved you then was that you did remember in the cab to ask me about the notes, instead of assuming that you were necessarily to arrange to meet the next day and go over them. Bill had already become so unguided that it did not occur to him that his own will, which he justified by the contents of the recent notes, a misuse of truth only seemingly on its own behalf, might be questionable. You took poor notes yourself here because you got mad at him on remembering this. You did try to will right in the cab, but did not quite succeed. The error is showing up now. Bill thus placed himself in an excellent condition to experience a fear rather than a love reaction. Helen Schuckman notes that she was going to write an excellent position, but did not do so. Answer: you are right about the misuse of excellent here, and please do cross it out. You are still angry. An excellent position for miscreation is not a meaningful approach to the problem. So it should state, Bill thus placed himself in a condition to experience a fear rather than a love reaction. I'm sorry, sometimes I think I speak too quickly. It was indeed discourteous. Indeed is not necessary. It was your own error here. I'm not saying this with any harsh overtones at all. I'm just trying to create better learning conditions for the study periods. We want as little interference as possible for a very good reason. So, it should read, it was discourteous. Now go back to Bill. He was discourteous to you when he told you that he wanted to keep the original copy of the notes, having decided to have it Xeroxed on his own will, and then justifying it by a very slight misinterpretation of what I said about useful for others. In fact, if he will reread the actual quote, he will see that it really means useful for him. You had interpreted it that way, and frankly, this was pretty clear to me at the time, but this sort of thing happens all the time. It should be noted, however, that the result was not only considerable and totally unnecessary planning on Bill's part, but also a failure to utilize what was intended for him as a help for himself. And before you get too self-satisfied, I would remind you that you do it all the time too. Bill acted inappropriately toward you by saying that he wanted to be sure that the original was not lost or dirtied. It is noticeable that having already decided what he wanted to do, it never occurred to him that it is possible that he might lose or dirty them himself, especially as he had not entrusted them to me. This is a form of arrogance that he would be much happier without. He should also note that this would possibly have not occurred had he been already literally off the beam. So he should also note that this would probably not have occurred had he not already literally been off the beam. Be sure to tell him that this pun is to reassure him that I am not angry. For if he does not get it or doesn't like it, I know it was not very good. The reason is that he put me in a position where I can really give him very little at the moment. But I want him to know that I am very well aware of the exceedingly few times he now makes errors of this kind. He has come a very long way in this respect. It seems a shame that he should allow himself even this much discomfort from it. The issue here is handling Helen's recent dictation from Jesus in a guided way. Helen had been impaired by her strain in forgiving Bill and her irritation toward the girl, but she partly rescued her state of mind by asking Jesus if she and Bill should meet the next day and go over the notes, rather than just assuming they should. Bill did not fare quite so well. In his unguided state, he assumed that he should keep the original copy of the notes for two reasons. First, so that he could photocopy them. Second, so they would not get lost or dirtied. He justified photocopying the notes by misinterpreting a statement from Jesus that the notes would be useful for others. What you, Helen, wrote can be useful to miracle workers other than yourself. Jesus says, however, that this really refers to Bill, which Bill will see if he will reread the actual quote. The result of this misinterpretation was a mess. Not only considerable and totally unnecessary planning on Bill's part, but also a failure to utilize what was intended for him as a help for himself. But before Helen can smugly look down on Bill for this, Jesus says that she too misinterprets his words in service of her own agendas. Indeed, we all do. This sort of thing happens all the time, he says, which implies that his instruction to reread the actual quote is good general advice. Bill's second reason for keeping the notes, to keep them from being lost or dirtied, was likewise riddled with problems. First, it was discourteous to Helen, and he acted inappropriately toward you, for it carried the message that the notes would more likely get lost or dirtied if left in her hands than if he took care of them himself. Second, it was arrogant, as it didn't occur to him that he might lose or dirty them himself, especially as he had not entrusted them to me. As Jesus is being quite critical of Bill, he takes great care to communicate love rather than anger. This takes at least three forms. First, he is careful to speak without any harsh overtones at all. Second, he gives Bill a pun, the meaning of which we cannot ascertain, to reassure him that I am not angry. Third, he praises Bill's overall progress. He has come a very long way in this respect. However, Jesus is having difficulty getting his loving tone across, in that he has to send it through the warped glass of Helen's lingering anger toward Bill. This distorts Jesus' words, particularly by adding emphatic words like indeed and excellent, that make his tone sound harsher. Jesus is resolute, however, in correcting these distortions. I suggest to you that we pray for him, and I pray for your full cooperation in this. This will correct your errors and help him react better to the work on the bookcase, which may otherwise lend itself for misuse by misprojection. There would have been no problem at all about the bookcase, and perhaps even no bookcase, if the solution of the storage problem had been left to me. I have promised to guide you out of problems and will certainly not create them for you. But this means that you do not undertake to solve them yourselves. A storage problem is hardly more difficult for me to solve than a space problem. See comments under Special Principles for Miracle Workers. suggestion that Helen pray with Jesus for Bill is expertly designed to correct both Bill's state of mind and her resentment toward Bill. In his current mental state, Bill is clearly prone to handle problems himself without asking for guidance. This is a problem for both Helen and Bill, who Jesus said should not undertake to solve problems themselves. The bookcase is an example of a problem that was not given to Jesus for resolution and to which Bill reacted negatively. A storage problem was noted. A bookcase was decided upon as a solution, and that solution was then implemented. Unnecessary difficulties were created when all that was needed was to turn to Jesus to receive a more efficient solution to the storage problem. You started well in your attempt to pray with me for Bill, but ended badly. This is because you had already made a number of earlier errors. You were wrong to be pleased with Bill Freed's criticism of Rose and should not have enjoyed Bill F's description of Zanvell's caricaturing of her. You could have laughed with Bill, but not at Rose. Real courtesy never does this. You should know that all God's children are fully worthy of complete courtesy. You should never join with one at the expense of another. When you called Bill about joining you, Jean and Anne, at lunch, you should have waited to ask me. In fact, you should not even have told Anne that you would call. Then you could have asked Bill first if he would want to come, and then called Anne back. It is true that it was better that he came, but this has nothing to do with the real issue. There are ways of treating others in which only consistent courtesy, even in very little things, is offered. It is a very healing habit to acquire. Bill's answer to your call was a clear statement of his own sadly conflicted state. He said, "I don't want to join you, but that's ungracious, so I'll go." Whenever any invitation to join others in an ungracious way is offered, it should always be met with respect, although it need not always be accepted. However, if it is met ungraciously, the resulting feeling may well be one of coercion. This is always a split-will reaction. Bill did not solve this by acting graciously. The lunch need not have entailed either mental or physical strain from him, and no need to escape should have arisen. This was a regression of the unprofitable kind. Bill will continue to experience this need from time to time until he is willing to realize that there is nothing he needs or wants to escape from. These paragraphs contain a striking picture of moving through the smallest interactions with courtesy, respect, and graciousness. First, Helen's efforts to pray for Bill ended badly because her mind was still infected by earlier errors. Specifically, she had relished and laughed at Bill Freed's skewering of Rose. In other words, she had joined with one at the expense of another. By doing so, Helen treated Rose with discourtesy. Rose was apparently not there at the time, yet this is immaterial. In laughing at Rose, Helen was being discourteous to her, no matter where she was. And as Jesus reminds her, all God's children are fully worthy of complete courtesy. Helen's discourtesy was still a weight on her mind and had now dragged down her attempts to pray for Bill. Helen was also discourteous to Bill by telling Anne that she was going to invite him to join their lunch. This put Bill on the spot. Now if he refused the invitation, Anne would know that he had chosen not to join them. It was true that he should come, Jesus says, but that was beside the point. She should have instead asked for guidance from Jesus, who would have told her to first call Bill, without telling Anne she was going to, and then call Anne back. This sort of courtesy, even in little matters, is the very healing habit that Jesus wants her to develop. Bill's response to the lunch invitation is a model of inner conflict. He didn't want to go, but he also didn't want to be ungracious. His will was split, so he decided to solve the split by acting gracious despite his feelings to the contrary. He told Helen, "I don't want to join you, but that is ungracious, so I'll go." However, responding to the invitation in this way was itself ungracious. Further, by identifying with the one side of his will, the desire not to go, he saw the impetus for going as coming from outside of him. He therefore felt like he was going under coercion rather than of his own accord. While at the lunch, he was still chafing from his hidden desire to not be there, and as a result experienced strain and a persistent need to escape. This represented the very sort of withdrawal from others that, with Jesus' help, he had been overcoming. Hence Jesus calling the episode a regression. In sum, he didn't solve anything by acting on one side of his will while secretly retaining the other, for that hidden side continued to cry out for satisfaction and consequently undermined things at every step of the way. It is very hard to get out of the chain of miscreation which can arise out of even the simplest misthought. To borrow one of your own phrases, this kind of human tragedy is far easier to avert than to undo. You must both learn not to let this kind of train reaction start. You will not be able to control it once it has started, because everything and everyone will be pulled into misprojection and misinterpreted accordingly. Nothing is lovely to the unloving. This is because they are creating ugliness. You, Helen, were definitely not acting right-mindedly by writing these notes right in front of Jonathan. Note, you wrote his name as Jonathan this time, although previously in these same notes you referred to him as Lewis, intentionally using his real name. Actually, of course, it does not matter what you call him, but note that you felt free at the time to choose the name you preferred to use. This time you were forced to call him Jonathan because you were attacking him when you took the notes in front of him, and now you were falling back on the magical device of protecting his name. Helen, I have been considering calling Bill rather I can't say this word, and I know ambivalently, and just got up to do so, but remembered to ask. The answer was to call him at 8:30. Jesus, it would be better if he called, but he may not decide to do so. If he does not, you should try to get through, and if he has decided not to be there, just leave a message that it is not important. This is still a kindly gesture, and the message should be put in a gentle way. Bill did call Helen Shuckman. Without going into further elaboration, we could devote many hours to this. Let's consider all the time that we had to waste today and all the notes that could have been devoted to a better purpose than undoing the waste and thus creating further waste. There is a better use for time, too. I would have liked to have spent some time on corrections of the past notes as an important step before reviewing them. A major point of clarification is necessary in connection with the phrase, replacing hatred or fear with love. No, Helen, do not check this against the prayer that Bill very kindly typed for you on the card. That was a gracious offering on his part, and you also accepted it with grace at the time. Why should you deprive yourself of the value of offering by referring this correction first to him? These notes did not continue at this time due to the obvious fact that Helen was still clearly not in her right mind. However, Bill later suggested that correct or correct for should be used instead of replace. At the time, he was quite sure about this, and he was perfectly right. The reason why it was essential that he make this correction was that the word replace was his choice originally and reflected a temporary misunderstanding of his own. It was, however, both courteous and necessary that he change this himself, both as a sign of his own better understanding and of an avoidance of correction by someone else, which would have been discourteous. Once again, the theme of courtesy in small matters comes through. Helen shouldn't have been taking dictation from Jesus right in front of Louis, as she knows the whole thing makes him uncomfortable. Helen was aware on some level that this was an attack on him. As a result, she felt compelled to call him Jonathan, magically hoping that if she put the wrong name on her attack thoughts, they would not find their target. Footnote 2 says see Cameo 9 about the names. Notice, too, how respectful are her instructions about calling Bill, perhaps to patch things up after their tense day. It's best if he calls. Perhaps he has been the one who was more unkind that day. Because of this, Helen should give him time to do that. If he doesn't call by 8:30, she should then try to reach him. If he has decided to make himself unavailable for her to call, she should leave a gentle message, saying that what she is calling about is not important. The kindness in all this is unmistakable. Lastly, Jesus wants to correct a scribal error in the notes that speaks of replacing hatred or fear with love. This may refer to this line from the prayer given to Bill in chapter 2. I pray that my fear be replaced by an active sense of thy love. Apparently, Bill had very kindly typed up the prayer on a card for Helen to use. Upon hearing that Jesus wants to make a correction, Helen's first impulse is to check what Bill had typed on the card and see if it needs correcting. Jesus, however, asks her not to, saying this discourtesy clashes with the graciousness of Bill's gift. This particular set of notes ends at this time, but we are told later that Bill had the feeling that the right word was not replace but correct, or correct for, and correct is inserted to what appears to be a second version of this prayer. Jesus says that he was right, and also that the original error was actually Bill's, which seems to imply that Bill's thoughts, just like Helen's, could distort Helen's dictation. Therefore, it was courteous and necessary that Bill correct the error himself, since this both reflected his improved understanding and enabled Helen to avoid the discourtesy of correcting him. So it should be correct in that prayer, which is in parentheses. Jesus' immediate reason for this whole discourse was to create better learning conditions for the study periods he had just assigned Helen and Bill. Yet, in the process, he ends up providing an in-depth look into how we typically live our lives and how he wants us to live them. The typical day he sketches out here is governed by the chain of miscreation, by errors that beget long chains of additional errors. In particular, unloving thoughts and unguided decisions lead to hurtful actions. This hurtfulness toward others then returns to us and then goes back out from us to still more people. We strain to fix things, but our solutions tend to cause yet more problems. It is as if our initial errors cast unwanted seeds into a garden, and even as we reach to pull up the resulting weeds, new seeds spill from our hands. We are caught in what feels like an unbreakable cycle. Our perception of everyone and everything gets pulled into this cycle, making the whole world look ugly. The day that Jesus is teaching Helen and Bill to have is just the opposite. We can see this day as having three components. The first component is policing the mind in the form of mind watching and thought correction. When Jesus says that Bill allowed himself fear-producing attitudes or was very unmiracle-minded toward Dora, or when he refers to Helen's irritation or strained attempt at pardon, the implication is that Bill and Helen ideally should have been watching for such reactions and then moving to correct them. The goal, in other words, is for them to police their minds and thus keep their thoughts free of anything except love. The second component is asking for guidance. This too crops up repeatedly. Bill should have asked for guidance about matters as small as the cab situation, the storage problem, and photocopying the notes. Helen should have asked for guidance about the lunch invitation, and she did ask for guidance about meeting to go over the notes, as well as about how to handle the phone call to Bill in the evening. The third component is giving miracles. Again and again in this narrative, we see that policing the mind and asking for guidance would have produced remarkably conscientious behavior. Behavior that Jesus describes as kindly, healing, gracious, respectful, and courteous. He is talking, in other words, about the very expressions of love that he calls miracles. Giving miracles is the dominant focus in this narrative. There are a dozen vignettes in which either Helen or Bill should have or did behave lovingly toward someone else. What is especially striking about all three of these components is that they extend down to a fairly minute level of detail. Helen was not supposed to privately enjoy the caricaturing of someone who was not even in the room. Bill was supposed to ask without giving their cab away. Helen was supposed to invite Bill to join the group for lunch before telling Anne that she was going to do so. This minuteness is something Jesus specifically points out in relation to the third component. There are ways of treating others in which only consistent courtesy, even in the very little things, is offered. In Jesus' vision of the day, then, Helen and Bill are meant to police the mind even in the very little things. Ask for guidance even in the very little things, and behave lovingly even in the very little things. As a result, the typical day in which unloving thoughts and unguided decisions lead to hurtful actions would be replaced by a new day in which loving thoughts and guided decisions would lead to healing actions. And since the people blessed by those actions would presumably pass that blessing on to others, the end result would be to replace the chain of miscreation with an interlocking chain of miracles. And so it is. Thank you for joining with me, Chapter 14, Cameo 14, The Chain of Miscreation. Great read. A long read, but a great read. I love you. Thank you for joining with me.